In the build-up to the 1934 German Grand Prix, the already formidable Nürburgring was transformed. Gone were the days of packing a racetrack with nothing but enthusiasts. Under the control of new Chancellor Adolf Hitler, motorsport was the ideal venue in which to display the might of his new, robust Germany under the Third Reich. Track facilities were draped in swastika flags, while a regiment of brownshirts had marched for weeks from Berlin to be present at the July event. Over 150,000 spectators had descended on the royal track, keen to lay eyes on the new German racing machines that promised to be unstoppable: the Mercedes W25 and the Auto Union P-Wagen. Marvels of automotive innovation, these Grand Prix cars were heavily funded by the German government and looked set to dominate the European racing scene in just the same way that Hitler was hoping to dominate the continent. Resoundingly, quickly, and packed with pageantry designed to inspire a nationalistic zeal. This month on Deadly Passion's Terrible Joys, we're digging deep into Nazi participation in Grand Prix racing with a two-part series, with each episode focusing on one of the two state-funded automotive programs. We're starting off this week with Mercedes, and then digging deeper into the exploits of Auto Union in the next episode, with an eye to understanding the complex and often uncomfortable role that motorsport played in the revitalization of the German military after the country was devastated by the First World War. Over these episodes, we'll trace the origins of the automobile in Germany and investigate the impact of the Treaty of Versailles on both industry and national image, in order to link Hitler's ascension to power with his emphasis on revitalizing the automotive and motorsport industries. Naturally, we're going to begin with a titan: Mercedes. Motorsport isn't just about fast cars and daredevil drivers. It's a place where scandals burn hotter than exhaust pipes. This is a history podcast dedicated to delving into the darkest corners of the racing world to uncover secrets, deception, and intrigue. My name is Elizabeth Blackstock, and welcome to Deadly Passion's Terrible Joys. Before we dig too deeply into the motorsport explosion funded by the Nazi regime, I want to take a moment to talk about why it happened and the greater purpose it served. To do that, we need to take a look back at the close of World War I. The conflict had begun in 1914 when Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was assassinated by a Bosnian Serb named Gavrilo Princip. Germany was a close ally of Austria-Hungary, while Serbia was protected by Russia. After Ferdinand's assassination, Germany encouraged Austria-Hungary to declare war on Serbia. Just a few days later, on August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia, and then on France. Germany had grown strong since the late 1800s, uniting with several nearby countries and ramping up industry, which included the production of arms to supply a strong military. When the conflict kicked off, the country felt it needed to go on the offensive to avoid being overtaken by enemies. It did so by attacking France, an ally of Russia, and it violated a neutrality agreement that had been established in Belgium. I'm not going to get into detail on the years-long conflict, but critically, when World War I came to a close on June 28, 1919, with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was pegged as the primary aggressor. The treaty forced Germany to accept blame for the war, which resulted in a serious weakening of the state. First and foremost, the Treaty of Versailles stated that Germany must repay the Allies for the devastation caused by the war. It's pretty much impossible to calculate any exact sum to compensate for all that damage, but there was a commission that studied what happened and set losses at around $33 billion in 1921. That's an unthinkable amount of money today, in 2025, let alone in war-torn Europe in 1921. Even though economists warned that no country could ever pay back that kind of debt without basically upsetting the balance of the world's economies, the Allies demanded that Germany do so, and the Treaty of Versailles included punishments if Germany missed payments. The fiscal weakening was only one part of a multi-pronged attempt to cripple Germany. The second prong was the near total destruction of the country's military. Conscription was banned, tanks were banned, its air force was outlawed, and the number of personnel in both the Army and Navy were capped in order to prevent any significant mobilization. Only certain factories were allowed to produce things like weapons, and the Allies kept a close watch on those factories. The final prong of the Treaty of Versailles involved chopping down Germany's territories. It was forced to give up its overseas colonies and to relinquish control over the land around its borders. By losing land, Germany lost a significant portion of its iron and coal producing regions, as well as a decent portion of its population. Further, large swaths of the country were also demilitarized. Germans were horrified. They had been expecting to give up something with the treaty, yes, but they didn't expect to be so economically weakened. They hadn't been invited to negotiate the terms of the treaty, which gave them a sense that they were being handed a dictated peace, not a genuine peace, and they resented the fact that they were forced to take sole responsibility for the onset of the war. The Kaiser government didn't collect taxes from Germans while the war was going on. Instead, it sold war bonds to the public to fund the advance. But after the war, hyperinflation meant those bonds were effectively worthless. And with its various industries kneecapped, unemployment skyrocketed. In 1922, when it came time for Germany to pay its first reparation installments, the country had no money to offer. As a result, French soldiers occupied the Ruhr, Germany's most valuable industrial area, with the goal of collecting missed payments by taking goods from the country. While they were supposed to focus on things like taking coal or industrial goods, the Allied soldiers also made a point of blocking any shipments of food or other supplies into Germany. Germans began to practice something that they called passive resistance by destroying their own goods, which resulted in violent conflicts between the locals and French soldiers, and Germany had to step in to rehabilitate over 100,000 German citizens that had been displaced by the conflict. And then, without any of the income from the Ruhr region, Germany's economy spiraled further. The country printed more banknotes, which in turn made those notes worthless and saw the cost of basic goods escalate. Wages for the few folks who could find employment had to be paid daily, because a twice-monthly payment would have required multiple wheelbarrows to cart all that money around. France was rightfully angry at Germany, but its retaliation was very severe. Countless Germans were left impoverished, trying to find a way of life in the rubble. It makes sense then that many of those Germans were irate at their own government for signing the treaty that was killing the country, even if that government didn't really have a choice. One problem was the whole German guilt thing. In Germany, most people believed that their country had gotten involved in the war as a response to Russia mobilizing its army. And if Russia wasn't to blame for starting the war, then certainly Austria-Hungary should have taken that blame. Germany felt it may have been involved, but it was by far not the only country at fault. The Weimar Republic had been established as Germany's government after the war, but the constant economic problems destabilized it right out of the gate, and many German citizens were keen to oust those officials as soon as possible because they blamed them for bowing to Allied forces. This was a hugely tense atmosphere, ripe for misinformation, disinformation, and retaliation, including something that we've come to call the stab in the back myth. Basically, this myth claimed that Germans didn't lose World War I on the battlefield. They actually lost it at home, where Jews, socialists, and communists conspired to actively undermine the war effort. It didn't matter that this myth was just that, a myth. It provided some kind of explanation for a truly horrifying period of time for many Germans and softened them to accepting more radical extremist, and nationalist ideals, all while shifting blame onto marginalized parties. One of the biggest proponents of this belief was Adolf Hitler, who was quick to adopt anti-Semitic, anti-capitalist, anti-Marxist, and nationalist ideals after World War I. As early as 1919, he was subscribing to the belief that Germany's ills could be traced back to various groups of people who weren't his ideal German citizen, and he used his strong speaking skills to continue to move up the ranks of political power. In his speeches, he would rail against the Treaty of Versailles and the politicians who let it happen, and the Jewish folks he felt destabilized Germany to begin with. He was good at promoting his speeches and rallies, and he was good at speaking to the fears and resentments that had bubbled up during the war, if only to manipulate those sentiments to his own political need. Before long, he was getting further and further up the ranks of the German political system, and no one was stopping him. But what does this have to do with cars? To start off, Hitler was an avid auto enthusiast, but beyond that, he appreciated what a thriving automotive scene meant. It meant industry was thriving in your country, that people were not only employed, but that they were crafting something exceptional. It meant Germany would be in a position to negotiate for supplies with other countries, which would therefore mean it wasn't as hated or feared as before. It also meant that the country was starting to see beyond mere survival and could look ahead to a future characterized by innovation and growth. It ultimately would mean Germany had once again come to play on a world stage. Just how important was the auto industry to Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party? Well, on February 11th, 1933, less than 2 weeks after becoming Chancellor of Germany, Hitler capped off a tour of speeches with one of the biggest events of them all, the Berlin Motor Show. There, Hitler promised to slash taxes and regulations that suppressed the auto industry, to build a robust national highway system, to dominate international motorsport, and to evolve the auto industry in line with the aviation industry. He ended his speech by proclaiming, "These momentous tasks are also part of the program for the reconstruction of the German economy," and with that, the Berlin Motor Show opened to the public. To further bolster Germany's automotive efforts, Hitler called the National Socialist Motor Corps, or NSKK, into action. This organization had been officially founded in 1931, but its roots could trace even further back, and effectively it was tasked with training German citizens in the art of motor skills, which included driving, racing, and maintaining their machines. It was all designed to bring into play another of Hitler's aims. A strong automobile industry lent itself to the development of a strong military industry. Yes, technically Germany was still barred from developing military machinery, but the automotive development made for a pretty compelling cover story for mobilization. If an automaker was building a powerful engine, then it was really easy to use the cover story that that engine was going in a race car. If that engine also just so happened to be a perfect fit for a tank or an airplane, well, that was merely an unintended consequence. And if countless swaths of German citizens were being trained to drive and maintain their cars that were flooding the roads, and those citizens just happened to become very good at commanding armored military vehicles in the future, well, again, not the publicly stated point, but a very nice consequence. There's another key factor here too, one that I think can be easily ignored because it's a lot harder to quantify. It has to do with the bolstering of the German spirit and once again uniting the country's people. For decades, to be German was to be looked down upon by the international community, and there wasn't a whole lot to be proud of. The automotive industry, though, was just that, an industry. It could provide jobs. The workers in those jobs could contribute directly to the economy, And if the best of their cars were entered into races in the international motorsport scene, and if those cars could beat the best of the competition from Italy or France, then that gave Germans something to be proud of, something to feel good about. After years of being treated like a weak link in the European food chain, Germany could start to reassert itself as an apex predator, at least on the racetrack. The athletes racing the cars would be seen as the finest specimens Germany could produce, the engineers a sign of Germany's fabulous intelligence. Aryans, Hitler claimed, were the superior race, and he would use motorsport to prove it. But even in the 1930s, the auto industry in Germany was still extremely depressed. It was rebuilding, but it was in no position to be comfortable dedicating tons of resources to building motorsport machines. So, the government stepped in to offer a little bit of financial assistance. Even in the 1930s, the company we know today as Mercedes-Benz was a force to be reckoned with. I'm going to dig deeper into the company's foundation in the next episode, because the roots of pretty much all commercial combustion engine cars can be traced back to Carl Benz. But how had the company survived World War I? What had its racing program been like before the interruption of the war, and to what heights could it ascend in the future? The Mercedes we know today evolved countless times throughout the years. As I said, its roots are in Carl Benz's patent for the Benz Motorwagen, the first automobile powered by an internal combustion engine. But it also has ties to the conversion of stagecoaches into automobiles, which was effected by Gottlieb Daimler and engineer Wilhelm Maybach. The first Mercedes automobile was sold in 1901 by the Daimler Motoren Gesellschaft Company, and its success can be largely attributed to Daimler employee Emil Jelinek Mercedes, who had an eye for marketing and felt that one of the best ways to promote his employer's latest machinery would be entering it in races. Both Benz and Daimler manufactured cars independently for years. In both the marketplace and in the racing scene, they were formidable rivals, with both becoming massive players in the German economy. But after the close of World War I, both companies faced a crisis. Automobiles are being taxed as luxury items by the government, which means that they were being priced out of reach of the average consumer. Gasoline itself was scarce, so even if you were able to buy a car, you probably wouldn't have any way to drive it. And as I mentioned earlier in this episode, Allied soldiers swept in to snatch Germany's key resources as a way to make up for the country's non-payment of its reparations, and workplace strikes further hampered production. With the foundation of their industry snatched out from beneath them, Germany's automakers needed to find a way to survive. Daimler considered selling a few of its manufacturing sites, but ultimately decided against it in order to continue producing things like bicycles, which were cheaper and had more utility to people who couldn't get their hands on gasoline. In 1923, it was clear that this burgeoning auto industry was about to die if something didn't change. And with the political climate still thick with international angst, survival came down to the companies themselves. Benz had already been feeling the pain, and it had already proposed a merger with Daimler back in 1919. Daimler had rejected it at the time, perhaps hoping the economic crisis was proved to be a passing fad, but both companies continued to struggle through the next few years as separate entities. When the economy didn't improve, both firms met in 1924 to hash out a deal that they named the Agreement of Mutual Interest. Under that deal, Benz and Daimler would standardize design, production, purchasing, sales, and even advertising. Both companies would still technically be preserving their distinct identities of their individual brands, but this agreement allowed them to pool resources in the interest of keeping both companies alive. But even that wasn't enough. And on June 28, 1926, Daimler and Benz merged into the company we now know today as Daimler-Benz AG. There was no real need anymore for the outfits to maintain separate identities, which necessitated a new brand name under which to market their jointly produced vehicles. They settled on Mercedes-Benz, paying homage to Benz founder Carl Benz and to Daimler's most successful model, the Mercedes. Of note here is the fact that the Daimler name couldn't be used to name cars because Gottlieb Daimler had allowed a ton of other companies to use the name when they purchased patents to manufacture similar machinery. Gottlieb Daimler, however, had not given consent for his name to be used for this specific car, and considering that he died back in 1900, there was no real way to actually gain that consent. Hence, Mercedes. Just weeks after Mercedes-Benz merged, its motorsport program saw its first success. Rudi Cracchiola, who, despite his surname, was decidedly German, took victory at the 1926 German Grand Prix in driving rain. He was just 25 years old and earned the name Regenmeister, or Rainmaster, thanks to the exceptional nature of his drive. To stick it out through these next difficult years, the Mercedes-Benz board decided to limit the number of car models the new brand would produce and to refine the manufacturing process at the outfit's major factories. A longtime Benz employee named Wilhelm Kissel took over, and one of the key promotional tools for the brand would be motorsport. At least until 1930. The year prior, the U.S. stock market crash had decimated economies all around the world, and Mercedes-Benz was feeling the pain. The company sent off letters to its greatest drivers, including Cracchiola, to inform them that it would be stepping back from the world of motorsport because the competitive arm of the company was dead. Cracchiola went immediately to Stuttgart in hopes of convincing Kissel to change his mind, but the Mercedes-Benz man was adamant. Racing was a luxury that simply could not be tolerated. So, Cracchiola headed over to the office of Alfred Neubauer. Neubauer was, to put it pretty simply, a presence. Tall and portly, he'd been a racing driver until the very moment he was decimated in competition by none other than Rudi Cracchiola back in the mid-20s. That defeat was enough to convince the man from Neuditstein to hang up the goggles and pick up the stopwatch. If he wasn't cut out to be a driver, he would become a team manager, and he would do it in a way no one had done before. Had you attended a race in the 20s and 30s, Neubauer would have been impossible to miss. Decked out in a thick trench coat with a slew of stopwatches hanging from his neck, he transformed the amateur world of race team organization into a refined art. He was the man who invented the chalkboard pit signs that informed his drivers of their positions in the race and their gaps to the cars in front and behind. He required an almost surgical precision for the process of pit stops, chopping down the time it took to service a vehicle from minutes to seconds. And despite the fact that he wasn't all that much older than Rudi Cracchiola, Neubauer had nevertheless become something of a father figure and mentor to the driver who just discovered that he'd be unemployed heading into 1931. Naturally, it was to Neubauer that Cracchiola went next to lament his fate. But Cracchiola didn't arrive alone. He brought with him his girlfriend Charlie, and as Cracchiola spoke with Neubauer, it was Charlie who suggested that if Mercedes couldn't continue in motorsport, well, Rudi may very well just have to go find employment with another team, like Alfa Romeo. The mere suggestion was enough to send Neubauer into fits. Even then, there was a sense of betrayal about one of Germany's best drivers going off to compete for an Italian team. This feeling like it would be a slap in the face to the might of the slowly healing German auto industry. When Rudi and Charlie left his office, Neubauer went directly to consult with Wilhelm Kissel. Racing, he argued, must continue at Mercedes. If it was too expensive for the manufacturer itself, why not allow Cracchiola to buy a discounted version of the SSK, the team's racing machine? Why not allow Neubauer to serve as Cracchiola's manager, to assemble a small staff of his own, and to return to the racing circuits around the world in order to continue dominating as Cracchiola and his Mercedes had done all throughout 1930? Neubauer was convinced he could pay for the program himself. The history books show that Neubauer was right, but in late 1930, Mercedes felt like it was still taking a massive risk in allowing a dedicated motorsport manager to continue competing. Still, Neubauer once again turned to his penchant for perfection in preparing Caracciola and the new, smaller Mercedes team for the first marquee event of the 1931 season, the Mille Miglia. The annual 1,000-mile event had become a point of pride for the Italian motorsport industry, and its organizers believed that no foreign driver could ever hope to conquer the rambling course that wound through towns large and small, up mountains and into valleys. Only the Italians would have time to even consider driving parts of the course, and even then, there was no real expectation that anyone would drive the whole entire thing until race day itself. That mindset was reflected in an entry list that was almost entirely composed of Italian teams and Italian drivers racing Italian cars. The expectations about the kind of car and driver that could win this race were shattered in the face of Alfred Neubauer's Mercedes team. Most outfits treated the Mille Miglia as an adventure into the unknown. Once their driver launched from the start line, he effectively dropped off the map until he hit the next checkpoint. But Neubauer wouldn't broach that uncertainty. Instead, he charted every single mile, the 1,000-mile course, and established a variety of locations for what he called rolling depots, or trucks chock full of mechanics and spare parts. If anything went wrong during an event, there would be someone on hand nearby to solve the problem. Caracciola won. It wasn't an easy victory. During the night, he dropped back through the running order, with his success largely coming thanks to an inspired drive through the final 250 miles of the event. But he did it, crossing the line with an 11-second lead over the Alfa Romeo of Giuseppe Campari. It was the first win for a German driver and a German car in the Mille Miglia, and it would not be the last. When Rudi Caracciola returned to Germany, he was summoned to speak with Wilhelm Kissel. No, it wasn't an offer for a full factory-backed ride or a recommitment to spending the big bucks on motorsport. Instead, Kissel needed a favor. A special customer had ordered a bespoke Mercedes, and the factory had been delayed producing it. To smooth over any potential pain, could Caracciola drive that Mercedes straight to the buyer? It would mean the world to this client, who would certainly appreciate speaking with a celebrity racer. That client was none other than Adolf Hitler. Caracciola was invited into Hitler's office, where a framed portrait of Henry Ford looked down at the two men as they conversed. Hitler congratulated Caracciola on the pride he brought to Germany with his Mille Miglia win, and then proceeded to pepper him with questions about Italy. How were the trains, the roads, and the people? How did Italians feel about Benito Mussolini? What were the living conditions? The future chancellor was perhaps disappointed in Caracciola's vague answers, since the driver had gone to Italy to race and not take notes on the Italian political situation way of life. But after a brief demonstration of the Mercedes, where Caracciola was advised to keep speeds below 20 miles per hour in order to avoid any accidents, he was able to leave. Caracciola came away with the impression that Hitler was perhaps not the most charismatic of leaders, but his passion for motorsport was, at the very least, something to keep an eye on. Despite all of that, Rudi Caracciola departed for Alfa Romeo at the end of the year. He knew his success with Mercedes had a limited shelf life, considering the fact that the automaker was still reluctant to invest in racing. In no time at all, the SSK would be outdated, and there would be no hope of winning. No German automaker entered factory teams in Grand Prix racing in 1932 or 1933. But in 1933, that promised to change. Rudi Caracciola was one of several German driving stars invited to the Berlin Motor Show, where new Chancellor Adolf Hitler announced that he would be offering a total of 500,000 German marks to the automaker that announced its intention to return to Grand Prix racing. And with that, the motorsport world was changed forever. When the Daimler-Benz board met at the automaker's Stuttgart headquarters shortly after the Berlin Motor Show, the moods of the assembled men had brightened considerably. After several difficult years, Mercedes was now greeted with an opportunity to redefine its brand on the world stage and to solidify its position as a friend to the German government. It was once again time to go racing. And that was largely thanks to the fact that many folks at Daimler had already maintained close ties to Hitler. The company advertised in Nazi newspapers and offered discounted vehicles to Hitler during his trips around Germany. The new chancellor was a fan of motorsport, so Mercedes would send its best drivers over to visit with Hitler. And when Hitler established the National Socialist Motor Corps to establish a greater understanding of automobiles all throughout Germany, racers were required to become members. Mercedes board members raised money for Hitler's political campaigns, and in return, Hitler reassured the manufacturer that it would receive favorable contracts in the future when it came time to start rebuilding the German army. That military aspect was huge. Orders for heavy trucks were already coming in at record pace, and Hitler had asked Mercedes to build prototypes of airplane engines and tanks. After a lean period of production that saw Daimler profits fall, the board members were very pleased to take advantage of any injection of government funds in order to start cranking out military products. Motorsport would take up much the same purpose by providing a huge propaganda blitz about the performance of German machinery and athletes. Manufacturers like Daimler hoped to take advantage of the increased interest in their machinery by becoming bigger players in the export market, but when they weren't entering motorsport, that was really, really hard. Heading into 1934, the Association Internationale des Automobiles Reconnus, or the sanctioning body that would ultimately become the FIA, had introduced a brand new set of rules for Grand Prix racing. Speeds were limited at a maximum of 140 miles per hour, while each race car was limited to be 750 kilograms at the heaviest. Between the development required to build these cars and the staff required to run the race team, Wilhelm Kissel estimated that it would take at least 1 million marks per year to be able to find its competitive footing. In modern US dollars, we're talking in excess of 8 million today. State funding was absolutely necessary for Mercedes to re-enter the racing scene, and it was something that had already been on the company's mind since Adolf Hitler had promised to invest in motorsport when he became chancellor. The announcement of the $500,000 endowment to any German manufacturer who represented the country in international Grand Prix racing was exactly what Mercedes needed. There was just one problem. It wasn't going to get the sum. A new company named Auto Union had popped up, and it had hired Ferdinand Porsche to design them a brand new race car in hopes of soaking up some of the funds on offer. We'll talk more about Auto Union in the next episode, but in broad strokes, the company was founded when four struggling automakers merged together in order to continue to survive. Those automakers, Audi, Porsche, DKW, and Honda, had never quite assumed the might of Mercedes, but because they were also interested in racing, Hitler decided it would only be fair to divide his 500,000 mark prize between two companies. Kissel protested, and in March, he and other members of the Daimler board drafted a letter to Hitler that argued it deserved the full prize offering. Since in the course of the company's history, the letter read, our mark has contributed frequently and significantly to the respect paid to Germany at sporting events. We would dedicate all of our skill and knowledge to this and would deem it an honor if we were enabled to represent the German flag in the future of the sport. Adolf Hitler agreed. He too thought the Reich should fund Mercedes' ambitions. He also still believed that Auto Union deserved the same, and so he firmly decreed that both parties would split the 500,000 marks equally between them. What to do? Well, there was only really one option. Daimler-Benz would go racing with its Mercedes mark, even though it wouldn't gain the full amount it had been promised. Yes, it would require more money pulled right from Mercedes' pockets, but board members assumed that it would be one small investment in currying favor with the Nazi regime in the future. During the winter, Mercedes embarked on an all-out effort to craft its upcoming Grand Prix challenger, which it termed the W25, designed by a Dr. Hans Neibel. Dr. Neibel saw the 1934 Grand Prix rule set differently than most other designers at the time. Remember that this is still fairly early in the history of automotive development, so things like aerodynamics weren't well understood. Most teams looked at the 750 kilogram weight limit of these new cars and assumed that a lower weight would necessarily mean a less powerful car, because in that era, they associated a heavier chassis with extra power. But Dr. Nebel disagreed. He felt it would be possible to wedge a big, powerful engine into an extremely light but durable chassis. It would just take some creative thinking to fit all those components together. The result was the aforementioned W25. Its engine was somewhat unremarkable. It was powered by a supercharged 3.3-liter straight 8 that Mercedes was already intimately familiar with. They tuned the engine to the extent that it could achieve 50% more horsepower than the rival Alfa Romeo P3, but they'd also ensured that the engine could cope with all that extra power by testing it. It was the construction of the rest of the car where Dr. Nebel got creative. Wherever possible, he used light metal alloys to cut down on weight. And the single-seater configuration, which was something new to Mercedes, provided a more centered weight distribution. Other advanced features included combining the gearbox and differential to reduce the amount of moving parts, hydraulic brakes, front and rear wheel independent suspension, a low slung configuration, and holes that were drilled in every possible surface to keep that weight down. The 750 kilogram weight limit had been introduced to reduce speed, but Mercedes found a way to make an even quicker car. Prior to the start of the 1934 season, Adolf Hitler sat down with both Mercedes and Auto Union to rattle off a list of expectations for the conduct of the teams and the drivers representing Germany. Hitler had been made Korpsführer of the National Socialist Motor Corps, and he took his job extremely seriously. Between April and September of 1933, under his control, NSKK membership rose from 30,000 members to 350,000 members. A lot of people tend to assume that that meant that any folks associated with the industry were likely to trend fascist. The truth, though, is that the skyrocketing numbers came down to the fact that Hitler required membership in this organization to do a lot of things, like be part of a race team, a motor club, or a driving school. So it meant that Grand Prix drivers had to sign up. Because the NSKK was effectively a paramilitary organization, Hitler and Hitler had extremely strict rules. Naturally, drivers were expected to do everything they could do to bring honor to Germany, but as international representatives of the Nazi Party, they were also expected to conduct themselves in a certain fashion when they were in public. And this included specific details such as how they were supposed to show affection to their spouses before and after a race. Motor racing, read NSKK propaganda, is no longer primarily about personal success, but a never-ending struggle for the success and honor of the Reich. It was in this pre-race meeting that the NSKK outlined all of those rules and expectations while also charting a list of races to run in a way that was designed to maximize German victory. The year got off to a slow start in large part because star driver Rudi Cracchiola had been severely injured the year before. After the close of 1933, Alfa Romeo announced it would be ending its racing program, which left Cracchiola with nowhere to go and very little time to find a ride. His close friend Louis Chiron found himself in the same boat, having been fired by Bugatti, so together they purchased some Alfa Romeo 8Cs and formed their own racing team, which they named Scuderia CC. But at the Monaco Grand Prix, 3 of Cracchiola's 4 brakes failed heading into Tibet, and he had a choice to make: crash into the wall or leap into the sea. He went with the former, and the impact crushed his right leg. He spent a year bouncing between different hospitals and his home in Switzerland, trying to regain strength in a leg that had been made an inch shorter due to surgery. And to make matters worse, his loving wife Charlie was killed in an avalanche, leaving Cracciola with effectively nothing to live for. It was his friend Louis Chiron and his girlfriend Baby Hoffman who brought Cracciola back to life. Chiron arranged for Caracciola to drive a lap of honor at the Monaco Grand Prix behind the wheel of a Mercedes convertible, and though his injured leg still ached, he had made up his mind. Racing was what he was meant to do, and he would do it with Mercedes. There were surely doubts on the part of the race team, but by 1934, Caracciola had become an integral part of Mercedes. Obsessed with cars growing up, he'd ended up taking a job with an automaker named Fafnir before moving off to sell cars for Daimler in 1923. Every so often, Daimler would provide him with a car to race, and he began to make a name for himself and for Mercedes on racing circuits around Europe. The team didn't owe him a guaranteed Grand Prix drive, but at the very least, it should allow him to test the incoming W25. It was off to Avis, a mighty stretch of straight road connected by 2 sharp turns, for that test. It was a mind-numbing track, one that would force Caracciola to keep the accelerator pressed firmly to the floor on the straights, to brake hard for one of the turns, and to maneuver the intimidating banked section that comprised the second turn. For a driver whose right leg was still in massive amounts of pain, behind the wheel of a car that one Mercedes driver said felt like driving a fast touring car on ice, it would be no easy feat. And yet he managed to set a lap of 235 kilometers per hour, or 146 miles per hour. That was more than good enough. Alfred Neubauer asked him then and there to rejoin the Mercedes team. Enlisting in the National Socialist Motor Corps was a requirement to do so, and Caracciola wasted no time signing up. Word of the 2 formidable racing machines, the Mercedes W25 and its competing Auto Union P-Wagen, which I'll dig into more in the next episode, spread like wildfire throughout the European racing scene. The 2 machines were drastically different, but both were quicker off the line, faster down the straights, and tighter through the corners than anything anyone had ever seen before. Manfred von Brauchitsch, whose uncle Walter had become commander-in-chief of the German army, was confident enough to tell media that we shall win tomorrow because we are the strongest team. That race, in July, was set to take place at Montlhéry in France, the very day after what we later came to call the Night of the Long Knives, where Hitler ordered the killing of his rivals in order to assume more complete power without any threat of a challenge. Had a Mercedes or an Auto Union gone on to win that day, it probably would have cast a grim pall on the motorsport scene. But instead, it was Louis Chiron and Alpha who took victory, as one after another, the W25s and P-Wagens fell apart. Chiron celebrated his win, but it came with a sense that time was running out. The German cars may have failed this time, but the raw pace they displayed was a clear sign of things to come. And Mercedes and Auto Union clearly had the resources in place to return to their headquarters and whip up a solution before the next events. Those solutions were in full effect 2 weeks later at the German Grand Prix, an event that had become a significant rallying point for the Nazi Party. A regiment of brownshirts had marched for weeks from Berlin to be in attendance, while the Nürburgring itself was adorned in swastika flags and parading rows of soldiers, designed to instill both a sense of pageantry and pride in the hearts of the 150,000 fans who flocked to the German countryside in hopes of seeing a dominant display of force. Already, the Nazi Party was beginning to reap the rewards of Germany's automotive might, as motorsport innovations began to find their way into fighter planes, military trucks, and armored vehicles being manufactured by the very automakers fielding these race cars. 40% of the Mercedes team budget was coming directly from government financing. Hitler had only promised 500,000 marks to be split between Mercedes and Auto Union, and had instead provided Mercedes with 907,000 marks when the power of their machinery became clear. For every accomplishment, they were afforded bonus checks that encouraged them to keep pushing for more performance. At the 1934 German Grand Prix, Hans Stuck took the checkered flag behind the wheel of an Auto Union. The full force of the German machinery had yet to be unlocked, as many other drivers were tired, but it did kick off a pattern of dominance that would go on to last the remainder of 1934 and well into the rest of the decade. It was a dominance characterized by an attention to detail that no one had ever seen before in Grand Prix racing. The cars were stunning, but the German teams didn't hesitate to take an advantage whenever they could find one. Germany's national racing color, for example, was white, but in an effort to find even a fraction of additional pace, Mercedes and Auto Union stopped painting their cars and adding that extra weight, leaving the metal bodywork exposed and earning them the nickname Silver Arrows. The Silver Arrows arrived at races with truckloads of personnel and equipment. In the pits, they cordoned off their cars, covered them in cloth, and shooed away any photographer who might try to get a photo of the engine. Mechanics and drivers kept their cards close to their chests, unwilling to expose any secret that could benefit the competition. During pit stops, a formidable army of mechanics descended upon the car, each completing 1 or 2 tasks to utmost perfection. Alfred Neubauer, head of the racing program for Mercedes, was known for fastidiously laying out the pits in such a way that all necessary equipment was readily available to hand, and for becoming the first person to devise the pit-to-driver communication system to keep his drivers abreast of changes in the race or demands from the team. Coming into 1935, Mercedes had already begun assisting Hitler in the rearmament of Germany through the military contracts, while the government began to lay the fault of the country's failures squarely at the feet of the so-called enemies of the Reich. It was becoming impossible to avoid the political connotations of motorsport, but for drivers like Rudi Cracciola, they really tried to push those increased tensions to the side and focus just on racing. Over the off-season, Mercedes had refined the faults of the W25, and Cracciola was able to take an easy early victory at Tripoli in a win that Daimler-Benz hailed as showing the absolute superiority of German technology. It would go on to be a dominant showing for Cracciola and the Mercedes team. Of the 7 events comprising the official Grand Prix season, they won 5. The French Grand Prix at Montlhéry, the Belgian Grand Prix at Spa, the Swiss Grand Prix at Bremgarten, and the Spanish Grand Prix at Lessard. Cracciola was crowned European champion. International tensions simmered that year. When German drivers swept the podium in France, fans actively booed the French ministers in attendance, frustrated that their own countrymen were unable to build a car worthy of competing on their own soil. In October, Benito Mussolini ordered Italian troops to invade Abyssinia, and the lack of response from France and England helped him realize that aligning with Hitler may very well prove fruitful. As such, when it came time to sign drivers for the coming season, Mussolini ordered his Italian teams to specifically hire drivers from Italy. All the while, Hitler was personally approving driver hires for German teams. Louis Chiron was only barely improved, while at Auto Union, Hans Stuck was almost fired because he was married to a woman who had a Jewish grandfather. The 1936 championship would go to Bernd Rosemeyer of Auto Union, with Mercedes struggling to keep up and ultimately withdrawing partway through the year to focus on their next racing machine. But the following year, the tides of favor would once again swing back around to Mercedes. Grand Prix racing was originally ruled by the French, who had become horrified at how resoundingly they were being beaten by German cars and German drivers at every turn. So, the AIACR put its hands together, and for 1937 it unveiled a new regulatory set that it hoped would handicap German operations. Rather than limit weight, this rule set limited engine capacity with the hope of lowering speeds and allowing a broader variety of cars to participate. The AIACR implemented a sliding weight-to-engine ratio where unsupercharged cars could have a maximum engine capacity of 4.5 liters and a minimum weight of 850 kilograms, while supercharged cars could have a maximum of 3 liters for the same 850 kilogram weight. Critically, any kind of fuel was allowed. The plan backfired almost instantly. The German government was willing to offer Mercedes and Auto Union absurd amounts of money to craft these new machines, and their ongoing experiments with fuel mixtures would inherently give them an advantage as well. The best France could come up with was a subscription fund set up in such a way that motorsport enthusiasts could purchase lapel badges, and the money from those purchases would go to funding French race teams. It was clear from the start that that would never be enough. With the new specifications in mind, Mercedes set to work building its next racing machine, which it would call the Mercedes-Benz W125. To craft this car, Mercedes-Benz set up a new racing department that would do nothing but focus on the design of its new challenger. Rudolf Uhlenlaut was chosen to lead the design team, which was an interesting choice considering that he had never designed a race car before and was just 30 years old. However, he had logged hundreds of hours on the Nürburgring testing Daimler's road cars, so he knew quite intuitively how to build a car that could handle high-speed conditions at one of the most dangerous circuits in all of motorsport history. In his new role, he had a chance to test the old W25, and he quickly pinpointed one critical problem. The suspension was too stiff. It was almost impossible to make the car's wheels follow the curves of the road, and the chassis would flex in response. That formed the basis of the W125's design brief: a stiffer chassis and softer suspension. That kicked off a revolution. Within 6 months, Uhlenlaut and his crew of 300 engineers, technicians, and mechanics completely transformed the team's previous challenger. First and foremost, the entire chassis was replaced with a stronger oval tubular frame made of nickel, chrome, and molybdenum steel alloy, which, when combined, reduced chassis flexion immensely. Uhlenlaut lengthened the wheelbase for better stability, improved the brakes, and paid particular attention to that problematic rear suspension by bolstering its hydraulic shock absorbers. As for the engine, this new car would be fitted with a 5.66-liter straight-eight supercharged engine that Uhlenlaut had improved with a better crankshaft. And to stay under the weight limit, much of the car was constructed of light alloy steels. But just how revolutionary was this machine? How powerful? Well, in early tests at the Untertürkheim plant, the engine developed 589 horsepower, far more than the W25 had made at its most powerful and efficient spec. Just for comparison, the average road car was making well under 50 horsepower at this time, and no racing car would be fitted with a more powerful engine until the Can-Am Series Challengers in the late 1960s, and it wasn't until the 80s that Grand Prix cars returned to this level of capability. On the road, it was a dream. Rudi Caracciola joined the Mercedes crew for several weeks to run the 125 through its paces, and he found the performance astonishing. In first gear, the car reached 88 miles per hour. In fourth, the top gear, he hit 199. It was an astonishing amount of power, an astonishing amount of speed. If the W125 could hold together on the track, and testing seemed to imply that it would, then Caracciola would once again have a car capable of fighting the Auto Unions. But yet again, the Mercedes machine had teething problems. At Avis in late May, a race that didn't count for the championship, Caracciola suffered engine failure. At the first official Grand Prix of the year in Spa, an Auto Union took victory, and it was Bernd Rosemeyer who took a much-lauded win at the Vanderbilt Cup, an American race in Long Island noted for its handsome cash prizes. Adding insult to injury was the fact that the Silver Arrows crews were greeted at the docks in New York by angry crowds, which justified the team hiring Pinkerton agents to protect them, all while the American press hailed the beloved Rosemeyer. In late July, Mercedes turned the year around. The Nürburgring, the testbed of the W125, was packed with almost 500,000 fans desperate to see their homegrown drivers battle for the lead. While Rosemeyer had dazzled the crowd by landing his own personal plane on the front stretch, it was Caracciola who dazzled on race day, launching into a lead from his start on the second row of the grid, one that he held until the checkered flag. To celebrate his win, Caracciola and teammate Manfred von Brauchitsch were flown to Adolf Hitler's home in Bayreuth by Hitler's private pilot, Hans Bauer. Joseph Goebbels served as the welcoming party, leading both the drivers into the home for handshakes and photographs with the German chancellor. It was there that Caracciola's loyalty to Germany was quietly called into question. Bauer pulled aside the driver to let him know that many higher-ups in the government were concerned about his choice to live in Switzerland. Rumors had swirled that Cracciola had traded his German citizenship for a Swiss one. Those concerns were initially dispelled when Cracciola displayed his German passport, but it was very likely an unsettling moment for a driver who had gone there expecting celebration. The remainder of the 5-race championship season was a Mercedes washout. Von Brauchitsch won the next race in Monaco, with Cracciola taking victory at both Bremgarten and Livorno to win another championship. The title cemented Mercedes' role as the pride of Germany's automotive might. While the average road car had very little in common with the mighty W125s, the car's utter dominance and refined engineering made it the envy of the world. Exports were rising in tandem with the manufacturer's output, and naturally, that also meant increased profits. Tucked amidst these factories churning out road cars were factories churning out military equipment, with a Daimler-Benz salesman extraordinaire Jacob Werlein negotiating massive military contracts on the company's behalf. Again, this was a blatant violation of the Treaty of Versailles, but the Nazi Party had long since learned that for as harsh as the treaty's terms were, very few were willing to continue to enforce them. It was kind of like the world started to look the other way. Building up into 1938, Mercedes had once again begun designing its next iteration of the W125. Rudolf Uhlenlaut was once again in charge of the project, but this year Mercedes had also managed to convince Auto Union's Ferdinand Porsche to consult on a new design. The new machine would have a blown V12 engine, with the drive shaft moved slightly off-center to allow the driver to nestle closer to the ground. The team employed wind tunnel testing to improve aerodynamics, sparing no expense to retain its title as Hitler's favorite automaker. The racing program alone cost Daimler 4.4 million Reichsmarks that year, an absurd amount of money for anyone, let alone a company that had been miffed at the government's decision to split a measly $500,000 grant between itself and another company. And just for some additional context, France had arranged for a 1 million franc prize to go to the automaker who could run the fastest average time over a certain number of laps at Montlhéry ahead of 1938. The sum was not only much less than what the German marks were spending, but it was money that had to be earned, not merely provided. And companies like Bugatti and Delahaye spent way more money in order to develop cars capable of earning that prize, which meant that instead of developing its Grand Prix cars for future racing, they were refitting their current cars to accomplish this single task. It was two entirely different approaches to motorsport, and Mercedes had good reason to think its new machine, the W154, was going to be the class of the field in 1938. However, Grand Prix racing wasn't the only thing on Mercedes' mind. The outfit had been hard at work modifying a W125 to compete for many of the world's speed records. Here, too, a fierce fight had kicked up between Auto Union and the Daimler-Benz firm, with the Ruler Strait Autobahn serving as a battlefield during an annual event called the Reich Rekordwoche, or Reich Record Week. In 1937 edition had seen Bernd Rosemeyer of Auto Union dominate, as the modified W125 displayed a frightening tendency to drift toward the edges of the road at high speed. A disappointment, yes, but in January of 1938, they had a chance to try again. Hitler organized another set of record attempts to take place in tandem with the Berlin Motor Show, and despite Cracciola's warning that we cannot go on this way, one of us will die, both Mercedes and Auto Union showed up to fight. Bad weather delayed the first running on January 27th, but the following day, in the stillness of morning, Cracciola made his run up and down the Autobahn. His average speed was 268.5 miles per hour, breaking the record previously set by Rosemeyer by a whopping 20 miles per hour. Unable to speak after experiencing that speed, Cracciola determined that he had done his duty and returned to his hotel. But Auto Union was keen to respond as quickly as possible, ideally before the next newspaper edition went out to the masses recording Mercedes' success. Bernd Rosemeyer rushed to the track and, ignoring the wind that had begun to pick up, made a record attempt. He failed to usurp Cracciola's record on the first run. They closed off air intake ports for the radiator and topped up the fuel just before noon as the wind gusted ever harder, Rosemeyer went out to try again. He never returned. In a flash, the rivalry between Crutchfield and Rosemeyer had come to an end. The former was left to represent the greatest Germany had to offer in the racing department at the Berlin Motor Show, while Nazi officials hailed Rosemeyer's crash as an honorable, noble death, one dictated by fate as he pursued glory for the Reich. A robust testing program for the upcoming Mercedes W154 kicked off at Monza, tucked away in Milan, as Hitler began to alert the world to his intention of taking over Europe. The first major race of the 1938 season was at Po on April 10th, and Germany was gearing to secure a victory that seemed almost guaranteed. Daimler-Benz churned out press releases praising its drivers and engineers in the build-up to the race, while Wilhelm Kissel was hoping victory at the French track would lead more Germans to vote Ja on a referendum being held the same day. The referendum consisted of exactly one question. Do you approve of the Nazi list of parliamentary candidates and the Greater Reich's first conquest? It came as a shock, then, that the German machines were helpless in the face of René Dreyfus's Delahaye, which was fielded by American heiress Lucy O'Reilly Schell. Though Dreyfus was born to both a Catholic and Jewish family that practiced neither religion, his surname alone was so intertwined with continental conceptions of Jewishness that his win was a slap in the face to an increasingly anti-Semitic Germany. Daimler-Benz press representatives, stewing from the loss, framed the race as a dress rehearsal. It was, after all, a non-championship event. Of the 4 championship-eligible Grand Prix in 1938, Mercedes won 3. Manfred von Brauchitsch took victory at Rem. British driver Dick Seaman nabbed victory at the Nürburgring, while Crutchfield was triumphant at Bremgarten. The only other event won by another team, Auto Union, was a home victory for Tazio Nuvolari at Monza in September. Thanks to the fact that he had finished on the podium in every event, Crutchfield was once again crowned European champion. It would be the last full season of motorsport in Europe before World War II erupted in September of 1939. Mercedes was again dominant in 3 of 4 events that were hosted that season, with Hermann Lang winning both the Belgian and Swiss Grand Prix and Crutchfield winning at the Nürburgring. Trouble, though, was brewing in the Mercedes ranks. Crutchfield felt that the entire team, starting with Air Sailor through Neubauer down to the mechanics, boasted an obsession with his teammate, Hermann Lang. In a letter to Wilhelm Kissel, Crutchfield continued, Air Neubauer admitted frankly to Air von Brauchitsch that he was standing by a man who has good luck and whom the sun shines on. I really enjoy racing and want to go on driving for a long time. However, this presupposes that I fight with the same weapons as my stablemates. Yet this will be hardly possible in the future, as almost all of the mechanics and engine specialists in the racing division are on Lang's side. Ultimately, it wouldn't matter. After Germany invaded Poland, something as frivolous as motorsport would never last long. Its purpose, motivating German citizens in a sporting battle against foreign nations and co-opting racing tech for military uses, had been served. While the AIACR never officially selected a champion that year, the National Socialist Motor Corps decided that the true victor should be Hermann Lang of Mercedes, even though Auto Union's Paul Mueller had a much stronger claim to the title. When the war officially got underway, Crutchfield tucked himself away in his home in Switzerland. Mercedes-Benz, which had been steadily rearming the Nazi military through the production of its LG 3000 trucks and its DB600 and DB601 aircraft engines, continued production through the war. Passenger car manufacturing came to a halt in 1942 when it became clear the war would not be a quick one, and that Mercedes would need to increase the output of trucks and spare parts. To do so, as increasing numbers of men were drafted into war, Mercedes hired women and bolstered its ranks with forced labor from prisoners of war, detainees from concentration camps, and abducted civilians. Those forced labors paved the way for Germany's smooth transition back to economic production in the 1950s by bolstering Germany's economy during the war. It wasn't until 1986 that Daimler-Benz even acknowledged its role in supplying the Nazi military with weapons of war, and in 1988, it paid out millions of dollars in reparations to those former forced laborers. Over 60 million people were killed in World War II, with at least 11 million executed by the Nazi regime in historic acts of cruelty and intolerance. Daimler-Benz and its motorsport program played a significant role in facilitating the most devastating war of all time. With the onset of World War II kicking off, Grand Prix racing ground to a sudden halt. Exactly one major race took place after Germany invaded Poland, the 1939 Belgrade Grand Prix, because Yugoslavia felt that canceling the event would have likely provoked retaliation from the Germans. But the Grand Prix didn't exactly attract a stunning array of the world's best talent. The entire field was made of German cars, with one exception, a local driver who entered his own Bugatti. Italians had been barred from travel. The British government warned its drivers that attending the race could leave them prone to hostility, and the French by this point knew they had nothing to give. War was here. For the purposes of this episode, though, I'm going to leave you on something of a cliffhanger. I want to thank you immensely for tuning into this episode of Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys, and in the next one, we'll keep digging into Nazi participation in motorsport and how it transformed both Grand Prix racing and the art of war itself. Next time, our focus will rest on Auto Union, which was Mercedes' prime rival, and we'll wrap up with the impact that both of these automakers had on the actual construction of military equipment and what happened to them after the war. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the show, give it a rating, and leave a review. If you're hungry for more, please don't forget to check out the DPTJ Substack, where I'm digging into contemporary motorsport news, breaking down the barriers to becoming a motorsport journalist, and keeping you up to date with everything you should be rating. Finally, if you have further questions, sponsorship opportunities, or you just want to reach out, I have an email for that. deadlypassionsterriblejoys@gmail.com. Finally, we're ending with La Source, the segment named after the iconic turn at Spa-Francorchamps, but that serves as my bibliography for each episode. It's important to me to cite regularly and accurately, so I'm giving a shout out to some of the most influential sources at the end of each show, but as always, the full list is down in the description. This week I've drawn from quite a few historical sources, as well as books like Faster, How a Jewish Driver, an American Heiress, and a Legendary Car Beat Hitler's Best by Neil Bascom, and A Race with Love and Death, the story behind Britain's first great Grand Prix driver, Richard Seaman, by Richard Williams. Both of those are absolutely incredible pieces of history written in an almost novel-like format that really sucks you in, so I think they're two critical elements of any motorsport book collection. Thank you for joining me this week, and I'll see you for the next episode of Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys.